He didn't die. He rotted. While still breathing, his body was already a feast for flies. His wounds refused to heal. His swollen legs stank of decaying flesh. Servants had to cover their faces to avoid vomiting, and the most powerful king in Christendom was being devoured alive, little by little, inside his own palace. This was the end of Philip II of Spain, the monarch who tried to bend the world to his faith, but lost the final battle to his own flesh, an entire empire at his feet, and not a single remedy to spare him from the most intimate humiliation a king can suffer, being consumed from within while the world outside forgot his glory. Books praise the victories, the palaces, the maps painted in the colors of Spain. But almost no one talks about the end, the unbearable stench in the royal chamber, the insects feeding on a king's flesh, or the solitude of a monarch who ruled everything except his own fate. And if you, like me, enjoy true stories that challenge what the books tell us, subscribe now so you don't miss the upcoming chapters. And tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from? I always read them. Philip wasn't born a promise, but a demand. Being the son of Charles V, the most feared emperor in Europe, wasn't just an honor, it was a burden. Charles V ruled an empire stretching from the Alps to the Andes. He was a warrior, politician, diplomat, and devout believer. When he abdicated, he didn't just leave a throne behind. He left an entire system on his son's shoulders, and Philip, still young, received this world without the right to question it. He couldn't fail. He couldn't hesitate. He couldn't show weakness. But Philip wasn't like his father. While Charles rode horses and led armies, Philip preferred the dark corridors of palaces, quiet, reserved, observant. Many courtiers called him the Shadow Prince, not out of malice, but because he seemed to carry the weight of the world before even ruling it. He was raised with coldness, little affection, lots of books. His childhood resembled a monastic life more than a royal upbringing. He attended daily masses, studied theology, geography, history, diplomacy, and Latin. He learned early to suppress emotion, to silence desires, to maintain posture even when he wanted to scream. Philip was trained to be a king, the way a monk is trained for the cloister, with discipline, solitude, and fear of failure. At 16, he was already issuing orders in his father's name. At 18, he accompanied international embassies. At 21, he married, for political reasons, a Portuguese princess he had never seen before. By 30, he stood alone atop an empire so vast that the sun never set on its lands. But inside, he was a walled-off man, no close friends, no emotional outbursts, no known passions. Everything was calculation, duty, cross, and crown, and it was exactly that rigidity that would later turn him into a prisoner of himself, because a man who never learned to be human, only to rule, won't know how to deal with weakness when it comes. Philip entered power not as a charismatic leader, but as a shadow of a colossus. And that shadow, as the world would soon discover, knew how to expand, but not how to retreat. From a very young age, there was something about Philip that unsettled those around him. He wasn't cruel nor explosive, but he wasn't warm either. He was cold, distant, stern. He spoke softly, walked slowly, avoided prolonged eye contact. He always seemed to measure every gesture, as if the slightest misstep could shake the world. When he finally took the throne, there was no celebration in his soul, no spark in his eyes, just his usual silence and a meticulously filled schedule. He became King of Spain, Lord of the colonies in the Americas, ruler over kingdoms in Italy and Flanders, with legitimate claims over distant territories like the Philippines, named in his honor. But he treated all of it with a somber sobriety, almost like a predestined burden. They called him Philip the Prudent, and it wasn't a compliment, it was a warning. While other monarchs enjoyed pomp, he preferred seclusion. While kings laughed loudly at banquets, Philip dined in silence with 3 or 4 aides. His ministers said he spent hours, sometimes entire nights, reading personal reports, one by one, line by line. Nothing escaped him. This meticulousness made him efficient, but also dangerous. Because for Philip, ruling wasn't a conversation. It was a conviction. He rarely changed his mind. And once he made a decision, he stuck to it to the bitter end, even when reality screamed otherwise. He was obsessed with detail, yet blind to the chaos brewing behind the scenes. To him, everything could be solved with another decree. More paper, more silence, more isolation. At first, this seemed like virtue. The stability of his administration impressed many. Order was strict, protocols followed. Spain flourished in gold, silver, and art. But there were cracks, small, invisible, like fissures in a dam before it bursts. Philip didn't see people. He saw functions. Allies were pieces. Advisors, tools. Not even his children escaped this detachment. He loved order more than affection, the empire more than bonds, the image of power more than human contact. And this trait, nurtured since childhood, would become the key to his downfall. Because a king who doesn't allow himself to feel also can't recognize when everything around him is falling apart. To the world, he looked like an exemplary monarch. But behind the walls of his own palaces, Philip was already showing signs that he would rule the way he lived, alone. To the eyes of the world, he was an exemplary monarch. But within the walls of his own palaces, Philip was already showing signs that he would rule as he had lived, alone. In the 1580s, Philip II reached the peak of his reign. He was, quite literally, the most powerful man on earth. He ruled kingdoms across 4 continents, controlled trade routes that crossed oceans, and determined the fate of entire peoples with a royal seal. When he inherited the Portuguese crown in 1580, he accomplished what had seemed impossible. He united, under a single command, the riches of the Americas, the commerce of Asia, the fortifications of Africa, and the political heart of Europe. No other king had gone so far since Alexander, Caesar, or Charlemagne. And Philip didn't celebrate. He organized. While European courts marked victories with luxurious feasts, Philip was consolidating administrative structures, creating councils, auditing contracts, and overseeing tax collection with an almost mathematical coldness. He ordered fortresses built, ports reorganized, secret treaties negotiated. Every new territory was treated as one more cog in a clock he wanted to be perfect. It was during this period that the expression emerged, the empire on which the sun never sets. And indeed, there was always a Spanish colony under the daylight, in the Americas, in the Indies, in the Mediterranean, or in Manila, which bore his name. But the vaster the dominion, the more delicate the balance. Philip trusted the structure, but not the people. He controlled everything with absolute rigor. He wanted to know about every letter sent from Seville to Mexico, every ship docked in Goa, every priest appointed in Flanders. His palace became a tower of decisions, where ministers took turns addressing matters from all over the world, while he sat motionless, listening in silence and writing with the same pen both commands and condemnations. He believed there would only be peace if everything was under control. But in the real world, the more control one demands, the more resistance arises. And in silence, the cracks began to show. Indebted provinces, religious tensions, discontented governors, allies turning into rivals. But Philip saw it all as administrative challenges, never as warnings. On the surface, his empire appeared unshakable, but inside, it was beginning to rot. And the man on the throne, meticulous and unflinching, didn't notice. Because sometimes the peak isn't the end of the climb. It's the beginning of the fall. And in Philip II's case, the fall began where he believed himself most secure, his faith. Philip wasn't just Catholic. He saw himself as the embodiment of divine duty on earth, a spiritual warrior disguised as a king. His religion wasn't merely belief. It was a state mission. There was no separation between altar and crown. To him, ruling meant protecting the faith, even if it meant destroying everything in his path. While other monarchs treated religious matters as diplomacy, Philip treated them as war. He believed, with unwavering conviction, that God had chosen him to preserve the spiritual unity of Europe. And that meant pursuing, silencing, suppressing, all with the certainty that he was saving souls. Inside his palace, he accumulated crucifixes, relics, and images of saints. The sound of bells was constant. The walls of his quarters were covered in religious icons, but the glow of faith hid the scent of fear. Under his orders, the Inquisition intensified. The flames returned to the pyres. Books were banned, thinkers persecuted, suspicions turned into sentences. The Church, alongside the Crown, began acting as a spiritual police. The king himself carefully reviewed lists of forbidden works, crossing out names, ordering arrests. In universities, young people were forbidden from studying abroad for fear of doctrinal contamination. Even high-ranking clergy, like archbishops and renowned theologians, came under investigation if their words seemed too lenient. For Philip, all of this was zeal, a sacred effort to preserve the purity of the faith. But slowly, the light he claimed to protect began turning into shadow. Spain stopped debating, stopped thinking, stopped growing. Intellectuals fled. Ideas were buried. Fear took over the plazas and pulpits. The fires purified bodies, but also burned the future. And while the world advanced in thought, science, and criticism, Philip was building a spiritual wall made of silence, obedience, and censorship. A wall that didn't keep out heretics, but kept his own people from breathing freely. His empire was, yes, the greatest in the world. But it was also becoming, little by little, the most suffocated. And Philip didn't see it as a tragedy. He saw it as faithfulness. His obsession with faith would become his shield, and also his trap. Because when a king confuses salvation with persecution, hell needs no demons. It comes dressed in justice and signed by the throne itself. Faith, when it turns into punishment, ceases to be light. In Philip II's Spain, that transition was silent, but devastating. The king believed that defending Catholic truth justified any sacrifice, and that's how he turned faith into a court, belief into sentence, and the pulpit into a scaffold. It was he who gave new life to the Church's most feared machine, the Inquisition. Spain became a model of religious surveillance, an empire where orthodoxy was mandatory and fear walked hand in hand with prayer. No one was safe. Families were watched. Neighbors denounced neighbors. One wrong word, one suspicious translation, one misunderstood thought. Any of it could be considered heresy. In the dead of night, hooded men would knock on doors and take people away without explanation. Some never returned. Others came back unrecognizable. They were taken to the dungeons of faith. There, they faced interrogations, torture, and often death by fire, the so-called auto da fe. The public squares became execution stages. Public, ceremonial, accompanied by prayers, priests, and crowds that trembled with horror and relief at still being alive. It's estimated that tens of thousands were burned, tortured, or persecuted during this period. Some for professing another kind of Christianity, others simply for daring to think differently. Philip oversaw everything closely. He believed that each condemned soul was a victory over the devil. But in silence, the country bled. Art withered. Thought died. The ban on books was brutal. Scholars fled to survive. The universities began to repeat dogmas instead of seeking truth. Even an archbishop, Bartolomé Carranza, theologian and royal advisor, was imprisoned for 17 years. Suspicion, having written something too close to Protestant reform. This intellectual witch hunt created a vacuum of thought. While the rest of the world was experiencing the first sparks of modern science, Spain was retreating into the darkness of fear. The people fell silent, not out of faith, but out of terror. And all this oppression was funded by the throne itself. It was the state that paid the inquisitors, signed the edicts, and ensured that no voice survived the long, dark night of fanaticism. Philip called it zeal. Historians would call it spiritual despotism. The king was convinced he was the guardian of truth. But in practice, he became the jailer of thought. And in that process, he lost control of what mattered most, his own people. The flames he had lit with such fervor now threatened to set fire to the empire itself. The fires of faith that Philip II ignited at home turned into political wildfire at the heart of his empire. In the north, far from the palaces of Madrid and the Castilian monasteries, a new kind of resistance began to take root. A revolt that didn't cry out for power, but for freedom, and it was born precisely where the empire profited most, in the wealthy Flemish provinces. What are now the Netherlands and Belgium, then called the Low Countries, were the crown jewels of Spain. Cities like Antwerp and Bruges shone with commerce, art, and free thought. But to Philip, that was precisely the problem. There, Protestantism was already thriving, and with it, ideas dangerous to a king who believed in one throne, one faith, and one will. Determined to cut out the heretical cancer, Philip imposed a brutal reform. He appointed new bishops without consulting the local nobles, increased the presence of the Inquisition, sent Spanish soldiers to control churches, courts, and even schools. But the Flemish people did not accept it. In 1566, the spark ignited. Protestants stormed cathedrals, destroyed images, and burned reliquaries. A cry of rage against the religious domination imposed by Spain, known as the iconoclastic fury. Philip's response was cold and crushing. He sent the Duke of Alba with 10,000 soldiers and a clear mission: end the disobedience. Alba did not disappoint. He created the dreaded Council of Troubles, nicknamed by the people the Blood Tribunal. In just a few months, over 1,000 executions took place. Among the dead were nobles, priests, and merchants, all accused of treason. But the spilled blood did not extinguish the revolt. It fueled it. A new leader emerged, William of Orange, a Protestant prince and brilliant strategist. Under his leadership, the northern provinces formed an armed resistance. What had started as protest became open war. The conflict would last for decades. Cities like Haarlem and Leiden were besieged, bombarded, and devastated. But the flame of autonomy never went out. To Philip, it was a spiritual war. To the Dutch, it was a war for survival. The war drained Spain's finances, unpaid soldiers deserted, inflation skyrocketed, and the coffers, once full of American gold, began issuing letters of bankruptcy. In 1581, the 7 northern provinces did the unthinkable. They declared total independence from Spain. The Dutch Republic was born, the first Protestant state to break free from Catholic imperial rule. Philip didn't just lose a territory, he lost the symbol of absolute control, and with it, the idea of an invincible king began to crumble. When Philip looked north, he saw heresy wearing a crown. England, now under the rule of Elizabeth I, was not just a political threat. It was a spiritual affront. A woman on the throne, Protestant, supporting rebels and raiding Spanish ships at sea. To a king shaped by Catholic dogma, that was more than diplomacy. It was holy war. Elizabeth funded privateers, men like Francis Drake, who stole Spanish gold and humiliated the imperial fleet in the Atlantic. Worse still, she executed Mary Stuart, a Catholic queen and potential ally of Philip. That was the final blow. Philip didn't hesitate. In 1588, he launched the greatest mission of his life: invade England and depose the heretic on the throne. It was the birth of the legendary Spanish Armada, over 130 ships, nearly 30,000 men, the Pope's blessing, crosses on the sails. Enough ammunition to devastate an entire island. The march began with prayers and promises of victory, but the sky had other plans. In the English Channel, the English ships used cunning. They launched burning vessels at night toward the Spanish fleet, forcing it to scatter. Without organization, the Armada became an easy target. And then came the blow Philip hadn't foreseen: the Protestant wind. A violent storm struck. Spanish ships were thrown against the rocks of Ireland and Scotland. More than two-thirds of the fleet was destroyed. Thousands drowned or froze to death. When the survivors returned to Spain, they were mere shadows, mutilated ships, starving men. The crusade had become a tragedy. Philip received the news with a whisper of resignation. "I sent my ships against men, not against winds and waves." But inside something broke. Spanish invincibility sank. The fear of enemies turned into mockery. England not only resisted, but became a symbol of Protestant resilience. And Philip, the champion of Catholic faith, watched his myth sink with every sunken ship. Even so, he didn't give up. He tried other expeditions in 1596 and 1597, but they were undone by new storms. It was as if the sky itself shouted, "Enough!" The war with England became an open wound, and while the sword failed, time exacted its toll. Philip's empire, once seemingly limitless, now faced limits everywhere. Limits of power, of finances, of faith, and of the king's own body. The defeat at sea was not just military, it was spiritual. And for Philip, more than losing to a heretic woman, it was losing himself before the very thing he had sworn to control: destiny. A king's body should inspire reverence, but Philip's inspired nausea. In the last decade of his life, what once was mere fatigue became collapse. The wars, the endless vigils, the guilt and fanaticism ate away at him from within. But now, what consumed him was literal. Gout, the disease of excess, struck mercilessly. First the ankles, then the knees, then the hands. His fingers swelled as if they were about to burst. And every touch, every movement, every sleepless night was a reminder. The empire still bowed before him. But his body no longer obeyed. He had to be carried. A special chair was created to keep him nearly upright, as lying down caused unbearable pain. The throne had become a prison, mobility, a distant memory. But the physical pain was not the worst. Open wounds on his legs began to rot. The flesh exposed holes, pus oozed out, and then came the worms. Yes, live larvae sprouting from royal flesh. It wasn't a metaphor, it was literal putrefaction. His skin split into ulcers. The stench filled the halls. Servants fainted. Curtains were soaked in vinegar. No one wanted to enter the king's chamber. The man who had ordered crusades, unified empires, and built palaces was now a sack of bones, pus, and faith, trapped in his room, surrounded by sacred relics. Encircled by priests reading passages about suffering and penance, as if the word could save what the body had already lost. He still governed. Yes, he tried. He scribbled orders with trembling hands, sent messages to ambassadors. But the empire no longer listened as it once did. It was as if God had allowed him to rot from within, slowly, as punishment for everything he had done in his name. For every heretic burned, for every rebellion crushed, for every woman silenced, for every decision made without mercy. His final days were lived as if he were already dead. The palace became a tomb. The king became a penitent. Philip spent hours in prayer, attended mass while lying down, clutched crucifixes like shields against death. But death was already there, digging with invisible claws, consuming every living part that remained. He who had dreamed of his empire's eternity now could barely endure the weight of his own breath. Disease destroyed him slowly, yes, but what truly killed him was the burden of his own glory. It didn't happen on a battlefield. It didn't happen on the throne. The true end of Philip came among extinguished candles, silent relics, and walls that no longer responded to his voice. Little by little, the king ceased to be king. He isolated himself in the heart of El Escorial, the palace he had ordered built as a symbol of his faith and dominion. But there, among dusty maps and furniture covered in white sheets, Philip found neither dominion nor solace. He spent his days confined to a special chair that supported his deformed body. The smell of infected flesh filled the air. No doctor dared say what everyone knew. There was no cure. The king was rotting alive. But what struck visitors most was not the disease, it was the silence. Philip didn't complain. He didn't scream. He didn't blaspheme. He prayed for hours on end. He requested Mass 3 times a day, demanded that priests read penitential texts, repeated old confessions as if each sin carried physical weight. Sometimes he wept. Other times he simply remained still, staring at a crucifix he held so tightly that the bones in his hand seemed fused to the wood. The man who once decided the fate of kingdoms now barely controlled his own bladder. He was cleaned by servants, turned on his side like an infant, fed thin broth, and even then he still tried to rule. He signed decrees with trembling hands, demanded reports from his ministers, rewrote letters that would never be read. The empire was already far away, and he knew it, but he didn't loosen his grip. He wouldn't accept defeat, because deep down he still believed his pain was part of a divine purpose. He wanted to die a martyr, a saint, an example. Reality, however, was different. Outside, ministers acted without consulting him. Enemies advanced at the borders, and the people, the very people he claimed to protect, groaned in hunger under unbearable taxes. No one waited for orders from El Escorial anymore. Inside, all that remained were echoes of ancient glory, and a man who was no longer a king, just a sinner trying to repay debts that not even time could forgive. Philip's final confession was not made to men, it was made to the void, to silence, to a God who perhaps heard, or perhaps not. Even before the sun rose, the silence was complete. In the shadowy interior of El Escorial, only oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the face of an unrecognizable man. His body, thin as the branches of a dry cypress, trembled with every breath. His eyes, once sharp as blades, now drifted unfocused, lost between pain and delirium. It was the end. On September 13th, 1598, around 5 in the morning, Philip II of Spain drew his last breath. A weak, almost imperceptible breath, as if even death respected the weight of silence in that room. He died with his hands over his chest, holding a crucifix and a fragment of what was said to be the true cross of Christ, surrounded by monks, children, and advisors. But paradoxically, alone. No crowd, no pomp, no hymn, just whispered prayers and the creaking of damp wood under the feet of the servants who waited, heads bowed, for the final moment. A king who ruled the world died as a prisoner of his own flesh. Death, however, did not erase the stench. Those who prepared the body reported that the open wounds, festering for weeks, had become colonies of larvae. The sheets were stained with putrid blood. The king, in his final sovereignty, had been consumed alive by something smaller than any army: insects. Not even his enemies could have imagined such a cruel ending. But there was something even more terrifying than the body. It was the weight of the silence that followed. When his death was announced, bells tolled throughout Spain. In some villages there were tears, in others, only relief. Many believed that with him also died the relentless Inquisition, the crushing taxes, the sunken ships, and the wars that never ended. His body was taken to be buried in the crypt of the Habsburgs, in the very Escorial he had ordered built with such pride. A tomb of cold stone for a man who, for years, burned with fever, obsession and guilt. The empire he left behind was vast, yes, but it was wounded, divided, and on the brink of collapse. On that sunless day, the world witnessed not only the death of a man, but the twilight of an entire era. A few days after the burial, royal advisers began to read through the inventories left by Philip II. There were maps, treaties, unfinished letters, and a library filled with volumes, many of them ironically banned by the very Inquisition he had so fervently supported. But among all the legacies, none was heavier than the real one: the empire. At first glance, it seemed grand. Spain still dominated half the known world, but behind the crowns and coats of arms lay a weary body, in debt and bleeding from within. The royal treasury was on the verge of bankruptcy. 4 debt moratoriums had been declared during his reign, the last in 1596. The mines of the Americas no longer yielded as before. The gold vanished before even reaching Spanish soil, swallowed by creditors, English pirates, and endless wars. His successors inherited an unstable throne, where every decision demanded not courage, but a miracle. The bureaucracy was suffocating, the generals were aging, and the people under Spanish rule no longer feared the name Philip. They wanted independence, a voice, religious freedom, something he had never allowed. Worse than the finances, however, was the spiritual state of the empire. The Inquisition, so heavily encouraged by Philip, had become a machine of fear. Universities had been silenced, thinkers exiled, and any innovation was seen as a threat. Spanish culture, which had once shone at the beginning of his reign, was now fading under censorship and fanatical orthodoxy. If the Spanish Empire still seemed colossal, it was only because the fall had not yet arrived, but it was coming, and it would come slowly, like the disease that had devoured the king's own body. Some historians would later say that Philip II built a stone castle atop a swamp. Others claim he prepared the end of the empire with every decision he made. By refusing to yield, refusing to listen, refusing to retreat even before reality itself. Maybe both are right. His sons and grandsons would have to face uprisings, protests, religious wars, broken alliances, and the burden of carrying a name that no longer commanded respect, but fear. There was no greater inheritance than his shadow, a shadow that stretched not only over Spain, but over an entire generation of kings doomed to rule in fear of repeating his mistakes, and without the courage to undo what he had begun. The story of Philip II doesn't end with his death. It lingers in every ignored decree, every lost nation, every flame lit by the Inquisition, and above all, in the silence he left behind. A silence that speaks louder than his sermons and deeper than his ships crossing the oceans. Because what he built with discipline, he destroyed with rigidity, and what he defended with faith, he lost by refusing to yield. Philip believed he could hold back the world with rules, prayers, and stone walls. But the tighter he clenched his fists, the more the sand slipped through. In the end, he wasn't defeated by an enemy army. He was overcome by what he chose to ignore: time, change, and human limitation itself. His final days, spent in a chair that held him immobile, are a faithful portrait of his reign, a man who still wanted to control everything, even when he could no longer move his legs. A king who still signed decrees, even with a trembling hand. A devout Catholic who ordered books to be burned, and later kept them for himself. The truth is that not even the saints he collected could save him from the pain he caused with his own hands. Today, his name is mentioned in books as a symbol of the Spanish Empire. But few remember that he died alone, with his body slowly rotting away in a palace he himself designed to be eternal, but which could not protect him from himself. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson left by Philip II. No matter how much is conquered, if the soul finds no rest, the empire becomes a prison, and the king, a prisoner of his own power. He wanted to be the hand of God on earth, but in the end, He became just another man trying to escape death, a king devoured in life by insects, by debts, by decisions, and by his own legacy. The man who ruled an empire on which the sun never set ended his days by the flickering light of candles, with a body infested and a soul smothered by his own history. While the world moved forward, Philip II remained trapped in his own decrees, in his unbending faith, the wars that never ended, the sins he never confessed. And so ended the most ambitious reign of modern Europe, not with a bang, but with a muffled groan, coming from a room that already smelled like death. If you enjoy uncovering the darker corners of history, the details the books prefer to hide, subscribe to this channel now, and get ready. In the next video, we'll reveal another breathtaking true story, one of those that reminds us that behind every crown, there's always a skull waiting its turn. See you there.